ordinance. Mr. City Manager, or City Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members. So before you tonight, this evening, is a proposed ordinance related to camping on public property. So it's not news that there's an increased occurrence of camping on public property. Now, this is a national issue. This is nothing special about Lacey, but it is obviously affecting Lacey, much like every other jurisdiction in this area. Now, a lot of this camping is occurring on areas that are not intended nor designed for camping. In fact, the camping is occurring, it's an incompatible use for a lot of these areas, and our city code does not address camping on public property. As you know, as we discussed at the work session last week, several jurisdictions, I would say most jurisdictions, have some sort of regulations relating to camping on public property. Now, regulation of camping in public areas is permissible. If I could just offer a little bit of a recap, there's a lot of discourse in the past couple years relating to this issue. I want to clear up a couple of things, particularly related to the Martin v. Boise case. That was a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision. Now, that case, really briefly, the city of Boise had an ordinance that criminalized using any of the streets, sidewalks, parks, or public places as a camping place at any time. What the city of Boise had at that time was an ordinance prohibiting camping at all. It was a blanket over the city. Now, the defendants, the plaintiffs in the appeal, were cited and convicted under that ordinance. And what the Court of Appeals was looking at was whether or not the Boise ordinance was constitutional under the Eighth Amendment. And the court's analysis, which is precedent for us, was no. It was not constitutional under the Eighth Amendment. Now, the Eighth Amendment, it does three things. It limits the type of punishment the government may impose. It prescribes punishment that's grossly disproportionate to the severity of the crime, and it places substantive limits on what the government may criminalize. And it was this third provision, the substantive limits on what a crime can be, that the court focused on. And the court found that an ordinance that criminalized the act of sleeping on a street was unconstitutional when applied to a homeless person with no place to go. Now, the holding was narrow. It did not dictate that cities have any affirmative obligation to provide shelter. It did not indicate that anybody that wishes is allowed to sleep or sit or lay down on any piece of public property at any time. Rather, what the ordinance or what the court held was simply, or not simply, I mean, it's a complex issue, but the holding was clearly limited to the fact that a jurisdiction cannot prosecute homeless individuals for being homeless, for involuntarily lying on public property if they don't have anywhere to go. So, again, regulation's permissible. It's not a solution, nor is this ordinance intended in any way to be a solution to homelessness. Rather, it's a tool for the council to consider. It would offer the city control over what types of places would be appropriate for camping, where those public facilities might be that would be appropriate for camping, and perhaps when those facilities might be appropriate to be used for camping. The proposed ordinance does prohibit camping in public places, but it includes provisions which prohibit the enforcement against persons camping due to homelessness when adequate shelter is not available. So that is a brief recap. Of course, we could talk all night about this, but the recommendation is that council take action to adopt an ordinance adding a new chapter related to camping to the Lacey Municipal Code.
So before we get started, I need some definitions here. How do we determine what is adequate shelter space available?
What question?
There's a lot of undefined terms from the Boise decision, and there's no clear, bright line rule as to what adequate shelter space is. This is not an area that's going to be, it's just not clear. I think it would be safe to say that an area that's equal to or better than what is being used would be adequate shelter space. And again, it's going to be fact specific. It's going to be determinant on what the circumstances are. Obviously, a house with a bed and a kitchen and all that would certainly be adequate shelter space. If somebody is in a motorhome, their shelter space isn't really going to change. They're not looking necessarily, I wouldn't think, for something different, but it's, maybe where would be more appropriate there.
So this specifically says that this ordinance cannot be enforced unless there is adequate shelter space available someplace else than from the public property that you're specifically asking them to move from.
Correct, and there's going to be some discretion involved there. The ordinance also contemplates policies to be developed by the police department. And officer involvement and officer discretion is always going to be a factor here. But again, I can't offer you a clear definition of what that is. That's not defined in the ordinance itself.
So I'd like to hear from.
Can I ask a clarifying question first? So, and I understand there's no bright line, so I get it's not an easy question to answer, but for the sake of us on council as well as the public, in your opinion, if we had, say we're making someone move, or police are asking someone to move from camping spot X, and we have another place where we've determined as a city that we're okay with them camping, there's no, certainly not any less, the condition's not any lesser than where they are. Would that, in your opinion, meet that definition?
I would think that would be appropriate.
Thank you.
So, Chief, can you tell me, given this ordinance, what would be the police's response to this ordinance?
Certainly, Mayor. So one thing I think that it gets lost in the discussion when we talk about a camping ordinance is when people observe people camping out in public, it's not always a call of a criminal complaint. It's a call of people that are sympathetic to somebody that's out, out without shelter. And they call the police department. And what this ordinance does is it gives us the authority, the legal authority to contact those individuals. So if there's something criminal in nature that's going on, that's what we do. We can handle the criminal aspects of it. But you have a very empathetic and caring police department, Mayor. And we understand that there's a need for us to engage our homeless community and provide whatever assistance we can to them to get some assistance. So I'm looking at this ordinance as much more than it's the enforcement of a camping ordinance. It gives us the ability to actually contact these individuals and make a difference, whether that is something, if it's criminal in nature, again, that's something we can take care of, but it also gives us the ability to address these individuals and look out for their care and safety as well, and hopefully find some of them assistance, some means to get out of the public area, to get off the street, and to be in a safe environment.
Okay, so I guess the question I have before I open up to the council, and we can take some questions from the audience, is if we haven't determined a different place, a specific place where they would be allowed to shelter for a time. So until we have determined where that location is, this ordinance isn't enforceable. Is that correct?
The ordinance includes provisions that prohibit enforcement against a person camping due to homelessness if there's no shelter available. So in your hypothetical, if there is no alternate shelter available, you're directing law enforcement not to take action and not to cite.
Okay.
Now, one's got to come first at some point, again, and this is a tool. If there is shelter space available, then what the council is indicating is that they're choosing to limit where this sort of activity is appropriate.
But right now, to my knowledge, we haven't had any individuals camping on public property in a tent or anything like that. What the city of Lacey is currently dealing with is people who are in RVs or trailers or in a car right here on City Hall, right? We've had RVs and trailers here at City Hall for over a month. And so right now, do we have space for them to go if they can't be at City Hall if we pass this ordinance, right? I mean, or
I'll defer to Chief Semko on this point. I do believe there's multiple instances of persons camping in tents in the city. It's not limited to what's occurring at City Hall.
And that's correct. We have had several calls for service for citizens that are concerned with people that are camping on public areas. And currently, absent the ordinance, we can make contact with those individuals and hope that they're amicable to engaging in a conversation. If they're not, then we have no legal authority to follow up or do anything else other than start a conversation. So again, this would give us the ability to dig a little bit deeper and see if there was something more we could do to help with the situation.